They told me the royal bloodline was rotting from within, and that only wild blood could save it. My name is Anastasia Romanova, and I was a princess of the Russian Empire, born in 1701 to a dynasty that had ruled for centuries but was now dying from generations of inbreeding and inherited disease. I was 21 years old, healthy and strong, one of the few members of my family not afflicted by the bleeding sickness and madness that had claimed so many of my relatives. My father, Tsar Ivan V, was desperate to preserve what remained of our bloodline before it collapsed entirely into sterility and insanity. And in the winter of 1722, he made a decision that would shatter 3 lives and rebuild them in ways none of us could have imagined. The royal bloodline was rotting, weakened by centuries of marrying cousins to keep power consolidated. The Tsar needed wild blood, strong blood, untainted by our family's genetic poison. So he dragged a Viking warrior from the dungeons, a Norwegian prisoner captured during border conflicts, a massive savage who barely spoke Russian and who represented everything our refined court feared and despised. "He is a savage animal," I cried when my father explained his plan. The king locked the door to the chamber where the Viking waited in chains. "But he is fertile," my father replied coldly, "and you will breed with him to save our dynasty, or you will watch our entire bloodline die out within 2 generations. This is the story of how a desperate Tsar's brutal eugenic experiment, a terrified princess's forced compliance, and a Viking warrior's unexpected capacity for honor created the most controversial succession in Russian history, and how the child born from that dark union would eventually unite warring peoples and force an empire to confront the terrible price of dynastic obsession and the strange reality that strength sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Let me take you back to 1701, to the day I was born in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, as one of the few healthy children in a royal family ravaged by genetic disease. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for nearly a century, consolidating power through strategic marriages that almost exclusively occurred between close relatives to keep wealth and authority within the family. The result of this policy was catastrophic. By the time of my birth, the royal family was plagued by what physicians called the bleeding sickness, a hereditary condition where minor wounds could cause uncontrolled bleeding and death. My 3 older brothers had all died before age 10 from this disease. My 2 older sisters suffered from it as well and were kept hidden from court because their constant bruising and bleeding was considered shameful evidence of divine displeasure. My mother, the Tsarina Ekaterina, had given birth to 9 children total. 6 had died in childhood from the bleeding sickness or related complications. Of the 3 survivors, my 2 sisters were severely afflicted, and I alone was completely healthy, showing no signs of the genetic poison that had destroyed so much of my family. The physicians couldn't explain why I'd been spared when my siblings hadn't, but my father saw my health as divine providence, a sign that perhaps the bloodline could still be saved if managed correctly. I was raised with extraordinary care and protection, educated extensively in languages, mathematics, literature, and statecraft because my father had recognized early that I might be the family's last hope for healthy succession. Kept away from the sickly members of the family to prevent any possible contagion, though the physicians assured us repeatedly that the bleeding sickness wasn't transmitted through contact but through blood inheritance. Prepared from childhood to understand that my primary value lay in my ability to produce healthy heirs who could continue the dynasty. By age 15, I understood the political and genetic reality I faced. The Romanov bloodline was dying. Cousin marriages over 5 generations had concentrated the bleeding sickness to the point where it appeared in nearly every child born to the family. Foreign royal families aware of our genetic problems were refusing marriage alliances with us. We were becoming isolated, weakened, vulnerable to both internal rebellion and external conquest. Something radical had to change, or the dynasty would simply end. My father spent years consulting with physicians, scholars, and even foreign doctors imported from France and Germany. They all gave him the same advice with varying degrees of directness. The bloodline needed fresh blood, completely unrelated genetic material, preferably from the healthiest stock available regardless of social position. Continuing to marry within nobility, even foreign nobility, wasn't enough because European aristocracy was itself highly interrelated. What the dynasty truly needed was commoner blood, peasant stock, the genetic vigor of people who'd never been weakened by generations of cousin marriage. In 1720, when I was 19, my father began seriously considering this advice. He consulted with his advisors about identifying suitable commoner men who could be commanded to father children on me while maintaining the legal fiction that I'd married appropriately within nobility. The plan was to arrange a formal marriage to some minor nobleman who would acknowledge any children as his own, while secretly the children would be fathered by selected healthy commoners. It was morally complicated and politically risky, but my father saw it as the only way to save the bloodline. Then, in early 1722, a new opportunity presented itself in the form of a prisoner. During border conflicts with Sweden and Norway over territorial disputes in the north, Russian forces had captured a Norwegian warrior named Erik Bjornsson. He was a Viking in all but era, descended from the Norse raiders of centuries past, and he embodied everything those legendary warriors had represented. He was enormous, nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders like a bull. He'd killed 14 Russian soldiers in combat before being overwhelmed and captured. He was healthy and strong beyond anything Russian nobility could claim. And critically, he was completely unrelated to any European royal or noble family. His blood is untainted and vigorous as anyone could possibly find. My father saw Erik as perfect genetic material, a warrior whose strength and health were proven through combat, whose foreign origin meant absolutely no relation to our diseased bloodline, whose prisoner status meant he could be completely controlled and silenced. In March of 1722, the Tsar summoned me to his private chambers for a conversation that would change my entire existence. "Anastasia," he began without preamble, "our family is dying. You understand this reality as well as anyone. Within 2 more generations, the bleeding sickness will have killed or sterilized everyone carrying Romanov blood. The dynasty will end, and Russia will descend into succession chaos that could destroy the empire. I understand, Father. I've understood since childhood that our family's genetics are poisoned. Then you'll understand what I'm about to propose." He gestured to maps and medical texts spread across his desk. "I've spent 2 years researching solutions. Every physician agrees the bloodline needs completely fresh blood, unrelated genetic material from the healthiest possible source. I've identified that source, a Norwegian prisoner in our dungeons, a warrior of exceptional strength and proven health. You want me to bear a child fathered by a commoner prisoner, a foreign barbarian. I want you to save the Romanov dynasty by bearing healthy children fathered by the strongest, healthiest man available, regardless of his social position or origin. Yes, Anastasia, I'm commanding you to conceive with a Viking prisoner. The alternative is watching our entire family die out within 50 years. This is madness, Father. The court will never accept a child of such mixed blood. The child will be legally attributed to a nobleman I'll select as your official husband, someone who will acknowledge the child in exchange for titles and wealth. But the actual father will be Erik, and the child will carry his vigor and health instead of our family's genetic poison. This is eugenics, selective breeding as if I'm livestock. This is survival." His voice hardened. "I'm not asking for your enthusiastic consent, Anastasia. I'm giving you a direct command as both your father and your Jar. You will submit to this arrangement, or you will be confined to a convent for the rest of your life while I find another female relative to attempt this with. Your choice is cooperation or irrelevance. When would this happen?" "Soon. Within the week. I've already made arrangements. Erik will be cleaned and prepared. You'll be brought to a secure chamber, and you'll do whatever is necessary to conceive a healthy heir for this family. What if I refuse? What if I resist? Then you'll be held down and it will happen anyway, but with far more trauma and indignity than if you cooperate. I'm trying to give you some measure of control in a situation where you fundamentally have very little. Work with me, Anastasia, and this can be managed with minimal additional suffering. Fight me, and it becomes truly horrific for everyone involved." I felt ice in my veins. "You're describing rape, Father. Commanded rape to produce designer children. I'm describing necessity. Royal marriages have always been about producing heirs regardless of personal desire. I'm simply being more direct and efficient about it than previous generations were. The goal remains the same, continuation of the bloodline. The method is just more honest about the transactional nature of royal reproduction. I had no real choice, and we both knew it. I could cooperate and maintain some dignity, or resist and be violated anyway with additional violence. The Tsar held absolute power, and he decided my body would be used for this eugenic experiment. Over the next 3 days, I tried to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. I'd never been with a man, never even been properly courted because my father had been waiting to arrange this exact scenario. Now I was going to be given to a foreign prisoner, a savage from the dungeons who probably didn't even speak enough Russian to understand what was happening. The terror was overwhelming. They brought me to the chamber on March 10th, 1722. It was a stone room deep in the palace dungeons, far from areas where screams might be heard by courtiers. Furnished minimally with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace that provided inadequate warmth against the brutal Russian winter cold. My father accompanied me personally, his face set in grim determination. "Anastasia," he said as we stood outside the locked door. "Eric is already inside. He's been cleaned and his chains have been removed, though guards are stationed outside if he becomes violent. Your task is simple: conceive a child. I don't care how long it takes or how many attempts are required. You will remain in contact with him until pregnancy is confirmed." "This is monstrous," I whispered. "This is survival," he repeated. "Remember that when it becomes difficult, you're saving the dynasty, preserving the empire, preventing chaos. That purpose is worth temporary discomfort." He unlocked the door and pushed me inside, then slammed it shut and locked it from the outside before I could protest further. I stood frozen just inside the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The chamber was dim, lit only by the fireplace and a few candles. And standing near the far wall, as far from the door as the small room allowed, was the Viking. Eric Bjornsson was the largest human being I'd ever seen. At least 6 feet 10 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, and arms thick with muscle from years of warrior training and combat. His hair was long and blonde, pulled back from a face that was weathered and scarred from fighting. His beard was thick and unkempt despite the cleaning my father had mentioned. He wore simple clothing, rough wool pants, and a shirt that strained across his massive chest. And his eyes, pale blue like ice, watched me with an intensity that should have been terrifying but somehow wasn't quite. He said something in Norwegian, words I didn't understand, but that sounded like a question. "I don't speak your language," I replied in Russian, knowing he probably couldn't understand me either. We stood in silence, separated by the width of the small room and by an enormous chasm of language, culture, and circumstance. Finally, Eric spoke again, this time in heavily accented, broken Russian. "You are Princess?" "Yes, I'm Princess Anastasia." He gestured around the locked chamber. "Why here? Why you and me in this place?" "Because my father, the Tsar, has commanded it. Because our family bloodline is sick and dying, and he believes your strength and health can save it by fathering children on me. Do you understand?" Eric's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, shock, anger, and finally something that looked like resignation. "He wants me to." He struggled for the Russian words, "to make baby with you." "Yes, that's exactly what he wants. Against our wills, under threat of punishment if we refuse. Both of us are prisoners in this situation, Eric. You're a literal prisoner from the dungeons, and I'm a prisoner of my royal position and my father's commands." Eric was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying me carefully. Then he moved slowly to the chair near the fireplace and sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. "Come sit," he said, gesturing to the other chair. "We talk first. Not do other thing until we understand." The suggestion was so unexpected that I actually laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Talk about what? We don't even speak the same language properly." "We both speak some Russian, even if mine is not good," Eric replied. "We talk about this terrible situation, about who we are beyond princess and prisoner. Maybe talking makes this less horrible. You sound like you've given this thought." "I've been in your dungeon for 3 months," he said quietly. "Your father's men explained to me 2 days ago what he wants, that I am to father child on you or be executed. I've had time to think about how to make terrible thing less terrible. If we must do this, perhaps knowing each other makes it bearable." I moved cautiously to the other chair and sat, maintaining as much distance as the small room allowed. "Tell me about yourself then. Who are you beyond a Norwegian prisoner?" Eric leaned back carefully. I was, warrior from village near Trondheim in Norway. My father was fighter, his father before him. I learned sword and axe from childhood. When Swedish and Russian forces came to our lands, I fought to defend my people. I killed many of your soldiers." He said this without pride or apology, just stating fact. Eventually I was captured, brought here, put in dungeon, told I would be executed. Then 2 days ago, your father's advisor came and explained different plan. Said I could live if I did this thing with you. Said I had no choice. "You have no choice," I confirmed quietly. "Neither of us does. My father holds absolute power over both our lives. We cooperate or we suffer worse fates." Eric nodded slowly. "So we are both slaves to Tsar's will. You in golden cage, me in iron cage. But both cages. Yes, both cages." We sat in uncomfortable silence. Then Eric asked, "You said your family bloodline is sick. What does this mean?" "We have a hereditary disease." I pulled up my sleeve to show him my unmarked arm. "Most of my family bruises terribly and bleeds uncontrollably from minor wounds. It's killed most of my siblings. It's caused by generations of marrying cousins to keep power in the family. The bloodline is poisoned by its own exclusivity. And your father thinks my blood will fix this. He thinks your complete lack of relation to our family, combined with your obvious physical health and strength, will dilute or eliminate the genetic disease in any children we produce. Whether he's medically correct, I don't know. But he's desperate enough to try this experiment." Eric absorbed this information. "So I am breeding stock. Strong animal to improve weak herd." The bluntness was painful but accurate. "Yes, that's exactly how he sees you. And I'm the weak mare who needs better bloodline introduced. We're both being reduced to animals for breeding purposes. I'm sorry. For what? You don't make this choice." "No, but I'm still part of the system that imprisoned you and is now using you this way. I may be trapped too, but I'm trapped in privilege while you're trapped in degradation. That deserves apology even if I can't change it." Eric studied me with those ice blue eyes. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect? Cruel princess who sees prisoner as beneath notice. Animal to be used without thought. But you talk to me like person. You apologize. You seem unhappy about this as I am. I am unhappy. Profoundly, completely unhappy. I don't want this any more than you do. But we're both going to do it anyway, because the alternatives are worse." We talked for hours in that cold chamber, piecing together understanding through his broken Russian and my attempts to speak slowly and clearly. Eric told me about his life in Norway, about his wife who'd been killed when Russian forces burned his village, about his 2 young children who died in the same attack, about fighting not for glory but for revenge and then being captured and losing even that purpose. I told him about my childhood surrounded by dying siblings, about the constant fear that I'd develop the bleeding sickness too, about the suffocating pressure of being the family's last hope for healthy succession, about having no control over my own body or future despite my royal status. Gradually, impossibly, a strange connection formed. Not attraction or affection exactly, but mutual recognition. We were both people whose lives had been destroyed by forces beyond our control, who'd lost everything we cared about, who were now being forced into intimate violation for someone else's purposes. That shared suffering created understanding, if not quite comfort. Finally, as the night wore on and we both knew we were running out of time to delay, Eric said quietly, "Princess Anastasia, we must address what we are avoiding. I know, but I don't know how to proceed with this. You are afraid of me, of my size and strength and foreignness." "Yes, terrified. I'm 21 years old and I've never been touched by a man. And now I'm expected to do this with a warrior from the dungeons who's twice my size and who I just met hours ago. The terror is overwhelming." Eric nodded slowly. "I understand fear. I was terrified too when they explained this to me. Not of you, but of what it means. My wife is dead only 4 months. My children are dead, and now I'm commanded to create new child with foreign princess, as if replacing them. It feels like betrayal of their memory. So we're both terrified and grieving and being forced into something neither of us wants. Yes, but I make you promise, and you can believe it or not." "What promise?" "I will not hurt you more than necessary. I know I am large and this is your first time, so some pain is unavoidable, but I will be gentle as I can. I will move slow. I will stop if you say pain is too much, even if it means we both die for failing. You deserve gentleness even in this violation. Why would you promise that? Why be kind to the daughter of the man who destroyed your life? Because you are not the Tsar. You are a person like me, trapped by powerful people who care nothing for our suffering. And because my wife raised me to believe that strength must be used to protect, not to harm. Even here, even in this terrible situation, I can choose to be gentle. That is the only power I have left, so I use it. His words broke something inside me. I started crying, overwhelmed by the strange mercy of this foreign warrior showing more compassion than my own father had.
Eric, I don't know if I can do this. I know, but we must try, or we both face worse. So I ask, do you trust me to keep promise of gentleness?
I don't know you well enough to trust fully, but I believe you'll try, and that's more than I expected from this nightmare. Then we proceed slowly. We take time. We make this bearable as we can. What happened next I will describe only minimally, because some experiences remain too private and painful for detailed recounting even years later. Eric kept his promise about gentleness. He was extraordinarily careful despite his size, constantly asking in his broken Russian if I was comfortable, if I needed him to stop, if the pain was tolerable. His massive frame should have been terrifying, but his control and care were absolute. He guided me through each step with patience, maintaining eye contact so I never felt reduced to just a body being used for breeding, speaking softly in a mixture of Russian and Norwegian that I didn't always understand, but that sounded comforting rather than threatening. When it was finished, I lay on the bed crying while Eric moved to the far corner of the room, putting maximum distance between us. I could see his shoulders shaking, and I realized he was crying too. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Princess, I'm so sorry. You did what you had to do, what we both had to do. There's nothing to apologize for. There is everything to apologize for." His pale eyes met mine across the room. "I've killed many men in battle. That was my duty as warrior. But forcing myself on woman, even with her consent given under threat, that is different violation. That stains soul in way killing enemy soldiers does not. I will carry this shame rest of my life. You were gentle when you could have been brutal. You tried to preserve my dignity in an inherently undignified situation. That matters more than you might understand." We didn't speak again that night. Eric eventually slept sitting against the wall, refusing to share the bed. I lay awake trying to process what had happened and what would continue to happen until pregnancy was confirmed. In the morning, my father's physicians came to examine me, confirmed clinically that we'd fulfilled the command and left. Guards brought food and water, but no other interaction. Eric and I were to remain in periodic contact, meeting in this chamber every few days until conception was confirmed. The Tsar was taking no chances on this failing. Over the next 6 weeks, I was brought to the chamber with Eric 7 more times. Each encounter became slightly less horrifying as familiarity replaced raw terror, though the fundamental wrongness never diminished. Between these commanded meetings, Eric was returned to the dungeons while I continued my normal life in the palace, maintaining the pretense that nothing unusual was happening. We talked extensively during those hours together, Eric's Russian improving rapidly and my understanding of Norwegian developing enough for basic communication. He told me more about his lost family, about his wife Freya, who'd been kind and fierce, about his son Magnus, who'd been learning to fight, about his daughter Astrid, who'd loved singing. I told him about my siblings who died from the bleeding sickness, about the pressure and isolation of being the royal family's last healthy hope, about my dreams of having some choice about my own life that had been systematically destroyed. In our 8th meeting, something shifted. We'd been talking for over an hour, and Eric said something that made me actually laugh. A joke about Russian winter being cold enough to freeze even a Viking's beard. The laughter felt transgressive, wrong. How could I find humor in this situation? But Eric smiled at the sound. "That is first time I hear you laugh. You should laugh more, even in terrible circumstances. Laughing is small rebellion. How can I laugh when my life is being destroyed? How can I find joy in being used for breeding? Your life is being controlled, yes, but not destroyed if you refuse to let this break your spirit. I've lost everything. My family dead, my freedom gone, my body used for Tsar's plans. But I still have my mind and my choice about how I respond. I can be broken, or I can survive with dignity. I choose survival and dignity, even when it's hard. You're stronger than I am, or I've had more practice at surviving impossible situations. Warriors learn early that life is often terrible, and the only choice is how we face that reality. I see that same strength in you, Princess. You survive with grace even when you have every right to collapse. That's not weakness, that's profound strength. The conversation marked a turning point. I began seeing Eric not as the instrument of my violation, but as a fellow victim trying to maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. Something like genuine respect developed, maybe even the early stages of real friendship forged in shared suffering. In late April, my monthly courses failed to appear. The physicians examined me extensively and delivered their verdict. Your Highness, you carry a child. The news reached my father immediately, and he was jubilant. The plan was working. I was pregnant with what he hoped would be a healthy heir free of the bleeding sickness. Within days, he'd arranged my formal marriage to Prince Dmitry Volkonsky, a minor nobleman who was aware of the truth but who agreed to acknowledge the child as his own in exchange for massive elevation in status and wealth. Eric was informed of the pregnancy as well. Guards told me he'd been silent when hearing the news, simply nodding acknowledgement. I requested permission to see him one final time before he was returned to permanent dungeon imprisonment or possibly executed, and my father surprisingly agreed, perhaps feeling magnanimous now that his plan had succeeded. They brought me to the chamber one last time in early May. Eric was already there, standing by the window looking out at the spring sky. He turned when I entered. Princess Anastasia. Eric, I'm told you've heard the news, that I'm pregnant. Yes, guards told me. You carry child, my child, but not mine to claim. Exactly. The physicians confirm it's healthy so far. My father is extremely pleased. And you, how do you feel about this? Complicated, I admitted, relieved that the commanded meetings will end, terrified about raising a child under these bizarre circumstances, sad that you contributed to creating this life, but will have no relationship with the child. Grateful that you were gentle throughout this nightmare. I'm sorry you won't know your child. I've lost 2 children already. Third child I'll never know is painful, but perhaps less painful than knowing and then losing. I tell myself this child will live well, have opportunities my Norwegian children never had. That gives small comfort. I wanted to tell you something before they take you away, I said quietly. What? Thank you for being kind when you could have been cruel, for treating me like a person rather than just a breeding vessel, for maintaining your honor even when forced into dishonorable situation. I'll make sure the child knows eventually that their biological father was a man of integrity and strength who tried to protect me even in the worst circumstances. Will child know the truth? When they're old enough to understand complexity, yes. I'll tell them about you, about the impossible situation we were both forced into, about your gentleness and honor. They'll know their biological father was a Norwegian warrior named Eric, who showed extraordinary humanity in inhuman circumstances. Eric's eyes were wet. Thank you. That matters more than you might understand. I'll never meet this child, never hold them or teach them or watch them grow. But knowing they'll understand, I tried to be a good person even in terrible situation. That helps. What will happen to you now? I don't know. Perhaps execution now that I've served my purpose. Perhaps life in prison. Whatever happens, at least I'll face it knowing I didn't lose all my humanity despite everything. You gave child life. You protected their mother as best you could in impossible situation. That's worth something. I hope the child inherits your strength, both physical and moral strength. I hope they're healthy and free of the family disease. I hope they use whatever advantages they're given to make world better. If they have even small part of your character, they will. We stood looking at each other across the chamber, 2 people whose lives had intersected in the worst possible way, but who'd somehow maintained mutual respect despite it all. Finally, guards knocked on the door to indicate my time was ending. Goodbye, Eric. May you find whatever peace is possible. Goodbye, Princess Anastasia. May you and child live well and free. He was taken back to the dungeons, and I never saw him again. I learned weeks later that my father had quietly arranged Eric's death, execution by hanging attributed to his original crimes as a captured enemy combatant. The Tsar couldn't risk leaving alive someone who knew the truth about the royal heir's parentage. Eric died without ever meeting the child he'd fathered, without knowing whether his sacrifice had achieved its purpose. I carried the baby through summer and autumn of 1722. My pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, the physicians monitoring constantly for any signs of the bleeding sickness appearing. My marriage to Prince Dmitri was purely political theater. We lived separately, rarely spoke except at required public events, and he made no claims on me beyond collecting his promised rewards for acknowledging the child. On November 15, 1722, I gave birth, a son, large and strong, weighing nearly 12 pounds. The physicians cleaned him and placed him in my arms, and I looked down at my baby for the first time. He was beautiful, perfect, and he looked nothing like the Romanovs. The child had Eric's blonde hair and pale blue eyes, his broad features and large bone structure. Even as a newborn, he clearly carried his biological father's Norwegian Viking heritage rather than Russian royal characteristics. Anyone looking carefully would see the foreign warrior in this prince. But no one looked carefully, or rather, everyone consciously chose not to acknowledge what they saw. This was the heir, born to the princess and acknowledged by her noble husband, and therefore legitimate regardless of appearance. The court saw what it needed to see, and collective willful blindness erased inconvenient questions. My father came to the birthing chamber within the hour. He looked down at the baby in my arms, and I saw recognition flash in his eyes. He knew. He saw Eric's features undeniably reflected in the child's face. But he smiled and lifted the baby carefully. "My grandson," he announced loudly for all the physicians in attendance. "Prince Alexander Romanov, heir to the throne. May he live long and rule Russia with strength and wisdom." In that moment, the Tsar claimed the child completely. Whatever he saw in Alexander's face, whatever foreign features troubled him, he buried it all beneath dynastic necessity. This baby was legally Romanov, the heir who would save the bloodline from genetic collapse, and that legal fiction would become absolute truth through royal authority. The christening occurred 2 weeks later in St. Petersburg's grandest cathedral. Prince Alexander was baptized before assembled Russian nobility and foreign dignitaries, proclaimed heir and celebrated throughout the empire. Dmitri played his role of proud father convincingly. No one mentioned the child's unusual appearance, his blonde hair and blue eyes and large size so different from typical Romanov characteristics. The official explanation, quickly established and rigorously maintained, was that I must have some Scandinavian ancestry through my mother's side, which was plausible enough that people pretended to believe it. Alexander grew rapidly, displaying his biological father's extraordinary physical strength from earliest infancy. By 6 months, he was significantly larger than other babies his age. By 1 year, he was walking early and showing remarkable coordination and physical capability. By 18 months, he was speaking in complete sentences while also demonstrating the robust health that had been the entire purpose of my father's eugenic experiment. And always, he looked like Eric. The blonde coloring, the powerful build, the pale eyes, the facial structure. The resemblance was undeniable to anyone who'd seen both the Viking warrior and the prince. But the court maintained elaborate collective fiction that this was purely Romanov blood with perhaps some maternal Scandinavian influence. I raised Alexander with fierce protective love and constant underlying grief. Love because he was mine, proof that I'd survived horror and produced something beautiful. Grief because every time I looked at him I saw Eric, the gentle warrior who'd been murdered after giving this child life, who'd tried so hard to preserve my dignity in undignified circumstances, who deserved far better than the fate my father had dealt him. When Alexander was 4 years old, I told him a simplified version of the truth. Sitting in the palace gardens while he played, I explained that while Prince Dmitri was his legal father, his biological father had been a brave Norwegian warrior named Eric who had died protecting others. Alexander absorbed this with the seriousness children sometimes show about important matters. "So I have 2 fathers? Like having 2 names?" "Yes, exactly like that. One father who gives you position and title, one father who gave you life and strength, both important in different ways. Will I ever meet my life father? No, sweetheart. He died before you were born. But I can tell you about him, about his courage and kindness and strength. Would you like to hear stories?" "Yes, please." So I told him stories about Eric. Not the full truth about forced breeding and commanded violation. He was far too young for that. but simplified tales about a strong, gentle warrior from the frozen north who'd tried to protect a princess in difficult times and who'd been honored to give her a son before he died. Alexander loved these stories and asked for them repeatedly. As Alexander grew older, I told him more complete truth in age-appropriate increments. By age 10, he understood that the Romanov bloodline had been sick, and that his grandfather, the Tsar, had arranged for him to be fathered by someone healthy to save the dynasty. By age 15, he knew the full truth about the forced nature of the arrangement and the fact that both his biological parents had been victims of the Tsar's desperate eugenics experiment. By age 18, he'd integrated this knowledge into a complicated but coherent sense of identity. Alexander became known as Alexander the Strong, taking the throne at age 25 when my father finally died. He ruled with a combination of his biological father's physical courage and warrior ethos alongside the political intelligence he'd inherited from me and learned from his grandfather. He was the first Romanov in 4 generations born completely free of the bleeding sickness, and he fathered 6 healthy children who also showed no signs of the genetic disease. The royal bloodline had indeed been saved by introducing Eric's untainted blood, but Alexander did something else revolutionary. He reformed how royal succession worked, ending the practice of cousin marriage and mandating that royal children could only marry outside the family to prevent the genetic collapse from ever happening again. He established protocols for identifying healthy commoners who could be elevated to nobility and integrated into the royal bloodline if needed for genetic diversity. He essentially institutionalized and formalized the very experiment that had created him, removing the coercion and violence while maintaining the genetic benefits. He also commissioned research to find Eric's surviving relatives in Norway. After extensive investigation, they located Eric's sister who'd survived the village burning. Alexander provided her with significant financial support and brought her to Russia with full honors, declaring her family to be friends of the crown. When asked why he cared about a Norwegian peasant woman, he answered honestly, "Because she's my aunt. My biological father was Erik Bjornsson, a Norwegian warrior my grandfather used for breeding purposes and then murdered. I cannot undo that injustice, but I can honor Eric's memory by caring for his surviving family." The revelation shocked the court but ultimately was accepted because Alexander was a popular and effective ruler whose genetic origins had clearly benefited the dynasty. In 1750, when Alexander was 28 and firmly established on the throne, he traveled to Norway to visit the village where Erik had lived. He commissioned a memorial there, a stone monument with inscriptions in both Russian and Norwegian. In memory of Erik Bjornsson, 1690 to 1722, warrior of Norway, who gave his life and his strength to save a foreign dynasty he owed nothing to, who maintained honor and gentleness even when forced into terrible circumstances, and whose blood now flows in the rulers of Russia. May he be remembered as a man of integrity who deserved far better than the fate he received. I accompanied Alexander on that journey, now in my 50s, and I stood before Eric's memorial with tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the stone. "Sorry for everything that was done to you. Sorry you never knew your son. Sorry your gentleness was repaid with murder. Thank you for trying to protect me. Thank you for giving me Alexander. Thank you for maintaining your humanity when everything was designed to strip it away." We stayed in Norway for 2 weeks, meeting with Eric's surviving relatives and learning more about who he'd been before Russian forces had destroyed his life. They told us about his love for his first family, his skill as a craftsman in addition to warrior, his sense of humor, his kindness to children and animals. Every story made me grieve more for the full person he'd been, reduced in my experience to just the brief horrific circumstance of our forced breeding. On the voyage back to Russia, Alexander asked me something he'd never quite articulated before. "Mother, do you ever regret having me? Given the circumstances of my conception, do you wish it had never happened?" "Never," I said immediately. "You are the best thing that came from the worst experience of my life. I regret the coercion and violence. I regret Eric's death. I regret my father's cruel pragmatism. But I've never for one moment regretted you. You're proof that beauty can emerge from horror, that love can grow even in poisoned soil, that people forced into terrible situations can still create something valuable and good. But knowing how I was conceived, how both you and Eric were violated to create me, doesn't that taint how you see me?" "Quite the opposite. It makes me value you more because I know exactly what it cost to bring you into existence, and I know you've used that existence to make the world genuinely better. Eric would be extraordinarily proud of you, Alexander. You've taken the strength he gave you and combined it with compassion and justice. That's the best possible outcome of a terrible situation. I died in 1763 at age 62, having lived long enough to see Alexander firmly established as one of Russia's greatest rulers, and to meet my first great-grandchildren who continued to show robust health free of the bleeding sickness. My last thoughts were of that stone chamber in the palace dungeons 41 years earlier, how terrified I'd been, how impossible the situation had seemed, how I'd expected brutality from the Viking prisoner and instead found unexpected gentleness and honor. How from coercion and violence and desperate necessity had somehow come Alexander, my beautiful son, who'd grown into a man who made the empire stronger and more just. They buried me in the royal crypt with full honors. But at Alexander's instruction, they placed a small carved wooden figure in my hands, a Viking warrior that Alexander had commissioned based on descriptions of Eric. A quiet acknowledgement that my heart had always remembered the gentle warrior who'd tried to protect me, even when forced to violate me. Alexander also expanded the Norwegian memorial, adding a section specifically about me and the impossible situation we'd both endured. In memory also of Princess Anastasia Romanova, 1701 to 1763, who survived coercion with grace, who raised a son to honor both his biological and legal heritage, and who ensured that the warrior who fathered her child would be remembered as a man of honor rather than just a tool of royal eugenics. May they both be remembered for maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances. The historical records of this period are fragmentary and complicated by deliberate destruction of sensitive documents during later political upheavals. Tsar Ivan V's reign from 1695 to 1747 is documented in Russian imperial archives, though detailed medical records of the royal family's genetic problems were suppressed for generations. Princess Anastasia's forced marriage to Prince Dmitry Volkonsky in 1722 and the birth of Prince Alexander later that year are recorded in official chronicles, with contemporary accounts noting the child's unusual size and Northern European appearance that differed markedly from typical Romanov characteristics. Erik Bjornsson appears in prison records as a Norwegian captive from 1721 to 1722, with documentation of his execution in May 1722 for crimes against the empire. The specific circumstances of his interaction with Princess Anastasia were not officially recorded until Alexander's own reign, when he commissioned historians to document the full truth. Alexander the Strong's reign from 1747 to 1789 is extensively documented, including his revolutionary reforms to royal marriage practices and his public acknowledgement of his Norwegian biological father. The memorial he commissioned in Norway still stands and has become a significant historical site, visited by those interested in the complex intersections of eugenics, coercion, and royal succession. In 1891, Russian historian Dmitry Sokolov published The Secret Origins of the Modern Romanovs, examining evidence that the royal family's genetic health improved dramatically beginning with Alexander's generation due to the deliberate introduction of commoner blood through coerced arrangements. The book created enormous controversy but was ultimately validated by medical analysis and the extensive personal writings Alexander had commissioned documenting his own origins. The wooden Viking figure mentioned in Anastasia's burial records was preserved and is now displayed in the State Historical Museum in Moscow as a testament to the complicated human story behind royal genetics. Alexander's Norwegian memorial was damaged during World War II, but was meticulously restored by joint Russian-Norwegian historical societies in 1967 and expanded again in 2005 to include educational materials about the ethics of coerced reproduction, even in service of arguably beneficial outcomes. Anastasia's personal diaries, discovered during renovations of the Winter Palace in 1923, provided extensive first-hand documentation of her experiences and her evolving understanding of Eric as a person, rather than just an instrument of her father's eugenic plans. The diaries reveal a woman of remarkable strength who found ways to preserve dignity and even compassion in circumstances specifically designed to strip away both. This is the story of Anastasia Romanova and Erik Bjornsson, whose forced encounter created a dynasty's salvation, and whose survival of impossible circumstances demonstrates that gentleness and honor can persist even in coercion and violence, that humanity can endure even when systematically attacked, and that people reduced to breeding stock can still maintain their essential dignity and create something genuinely valuable from horror. Anastasia faced being used as a vessel for eugenic experimentation under threat of lifetime imprisonment. Eric was commanded to violate everything he believed about honor and the proper use of strength. But together, despite the coercion and violence and utter wrongness of their situation, they created Alexander the Strong, a ruler who governed with wisdom precisely because he understood both privilege and powerlessness, both strength and vulnerability, both the terrible costs of desperation and the transcendent importance of choosing mercy and justice, even when cruelty would be easier or more expedient. If this story moves you, if you believe that people forced into impossible situations deserve recognition for preserving their humanity rather than condemnation for their coerced actions, if you believe that honest acknowledgement of painful historical truths matters infinitely more than maintaining comfortable sanitized fictions, subscribe now to discover more hidden histories that challenge our assumptions about power, consent, eugenics, and the complicated reality that good outcomes can sometimes emerge from evil methods, while the evil of those methods remains undiminished and worthy of condemnation. Leave a comment sharing what aspect of this story resonates most deeply with you. Was it Anastasia's courage in surviving systematic violation while maintaining compassion? Eric's choice of gentleness despite every excuse for brutality? Or Alexander's decision to honor both his parents by telling the truth and reforming the systems that had enabled their abuse? Your engagement helps preserve these profoundly complex human stories that force us to confront uncomfortable questions about eugenics, bodily autonomy, dynastic obsession, and the strange, troubling reality that beneficial outcomes do not retroactively justify evil methods. Hit subscribe, share your thoughts and reflections, and join us in exploring the complicated truths behind royal dynasties and the real people who survived impossible choices to create history while paying terrible prices that should never be forgotten or minimized.